So I'm going to demonstrate a couple of features of Islandora Workbench. I didn't intend to run through a whole big tutorial, but I'm happy to continue with more examples or whatnot after the brief demo. But the Islandora Workbench, and I'm just going to pop the URL to the GitHub repo in the chat here. So the rationale behind Islandora Workbench is that Wendy, just to kind of follow up on what I was saying earlier on, I want to be able to let people who are not scripters or developers don't want to learn that stuff just to be able to batch ingest stuff into Islandora, to have a set of tools that will let them add content and update content at some scale into Islandora 8, and to let them do it independently of other people who developers or scripters or sysadmins. I mean, when you need to go to them, you need to go to them. But if you don't need to go to them, you should not need to go to them. And so what Islandora Workbench is a tool that lets you add content, update content, delete content in Islandora 8 without having access to the Islandora server's command line. In other words, you don't need to log in to the Islandora command line via SSH to use it. It is currently and primarily a command line tool. It's a big Python script, but so you need to have command line access on the computer that you're using it from, whether it's your laptop or a dedicated machine in your institution or what have you. But there is a clear and stated goal and ambition to have a graphical user interface application that sits on top that lets you avoid using the command line altogether, and to use Workbench and do all the things it can do within a graphical environment, a regular desktop environment. That second part, the desktop GUI tool, does not yet exist. It exists in a prototype, which kind of demonstrates how it might work, but it is it's not far enough along to really use in production. Whereas the command line version, the underlying library, if you will, or utility that is Workbench, is ready to go right now with a couple of minor deficiencies, which I intend to remedy over the holidays. I'll pause here to ask if anyone has any questions, and I'll be happy to respond to them or give some more context. Okay, so basically, Workbench requires two things to run. It requires a CSV file, and it really only deals in CSV at this point. If you have a bunch of XML files that you want to, that's your metadata, like mods, for example, coming from Islandora 7, you would need to convert those to CSV and then use Workbench on that. And it's kind of a conscious decision, because as Danny put it one time, I think at the Islandora Online meeting, Workbench is very opinionated. It's very flexible. It's super flexible, but it doesn't give you a lot of options in certain areas, and that's because I would strive for it to do a specific set of things and to do them really well, and not be kind of a Swiss Army knife and do everything for everybody. Because CSV is the input format for Workbench. CSV is a format that most people are relatively comfortable with, whether it's being generated and maintained in a spreadsheet, or whether it's being produced by an automated process or by scripts or what have you. So for the moment, we're sticking with Workbench. That isn't to say that we can't have utilities that help you convert from XML to CSV easily and whatnot, whether that's bundled with Workbench or whether it's an external process like OpenRefine or what have you. But Workbench requires a CSV file, and it requires a configuration file. And what you see on your screens right now is a very simple configuration file, probably the simplest you could have. The simplest you could have is that, because you need to tell Workbench what it's doing. Is it creating, updating, deleting, adding media, what have you? In this case, the task is creating nodes and optionally media on the target Islandora. And you need to tell Workbench where your Islandora is sitting and what the credentials for the account with which Workbench will interact with Islandora are. And it is interacting with Islandora over HTTP. It's using REST requests to interact with Islandora to get information from Drupal about configuration in particular. The Workbench is kind of aware of how if you give it a content type, in this case, the default content type, you don't need to state it in the configuration file, but if you want to state it, you can. The default content type is Islandora, a repository item, whatever the machine name for that is. So Workbench goes out, very first thing it does when you run it, it goes out and it gets all the configuration for that content type. So it knows what fields are configured for the content type and other things of that nature. The configuration for a Workbench can be very minimal like this if you're using all the defaults. And I just want to show you, let's see, how do I need to show you, hang on a sec while I find my way. Sorry, new share. So what I'm showing here is, this is the GitHub README for Islandora Workbench, and all of the options that go in your configuration file are listed here. There's lots. They look scary. They are kind of scary. Don't worry about them. They're here really for when you need to deviate from the defaults. And as we can see, the content type, which I've already mentioned, is Islandora object. The input directory and the CSV file have default locations, things of that nature. So you don't really, if you only want to play with Workbench and don't want to mess with, don't want to get too crazy into the configuration, you can just use the defaults and literally then your configuration file can look like that. So we have a CSV file and you have a configuration file. What I'm going to show you first is how Workbench would normally operate, and that is to say you want to create nodes and attach media. I'm going to use this very simple CSV file to do that. And this CSV file has 3 records. You can see them here. It contains 5 fields or 5 columns. These 3, file ID and title, are required by Workbench. I'll explain them in a second. And field model, field description, these are fields configured on the Islandora repository, or the repository item Islandora object content type. And you can have as many fields as you want. You can have single value fields, multi-value fields, fields of a lot of different kinds of field type, taxonomy terms, free text, date fields, geolocation fields, things of that nature. Don't support paragraphs yet if you are interested in paragraphs, but there's an open issue for that, and it will do so in the near future. And any other kind of field type that you might configure in your Islandora. This is a standard CSV file, nothing exotic about it at all. It follows the same rules that any CSV file needs to be compliant, valid CSV, and that pretty much any spreadsheet application will spit out, including Excel and OpenOffice Calc. So in this case, we have description is pretty obvious. It's a human readable description, and it's going to show up in the node, like as you'd expect. The field model is a field in Islandora objects, and it tells you whether it tells Drupal whether the object is an image, a document, a page content, and what have you. And in this case, I'm using the text. It's a taxonomy, so it's a vocabulary. And in this case, I'm using the vocabulary, the term ID for the one that I want, which is image. This looks a bit weird, and it is, and it's a little bit of a usability issue with Workbench, but you can also use the term name. So you could use the word image here, or you could use the linked data URI for that model, which I can't recall off the top of my head, but you stick in in this place, you would use the linked data, which I think goes to either a Perl URI or whatever. The problem with using the name, the like image, is that if you spell it wrong in one case, or you don't capitalize it, the Workbench may create a new term based on what you put in here by mistake. It has pretty good normalization rules, so pretty simple and effective normalization rules. So there is some leeway for things like capitalization and things of that nature. But if you want to be precise, you would use either and error-free, you would use either the term ID, in this case 25, which is going to be specific to your Drupal. It's not universal across all Islandoras. Or the linked data URI, which is universal across all Islandoras. So, and in fact, the default is where I create defaults for taxonomy terms that have URIs. I use the URI because it is unmistakably what we mean when we refer to that particular taxonomy term. Those are the two optional fields: field model, field description. Title, all Drupal nodes need a title. It doesn't let you decide whether or not it's an option. It's there. So we have a title. It's an ordinary Drupal field title in this case, though. ID Workbench has a constraint, or enforces a constraint, where you need to have an ID in each row in your CSV, and that ID can be meaningless. It can be 01, 02, 03, or it could be meaningful if you want. It doesn't really matter, but Workbench needs to have a way to uniquely identify and reference every record in the CSV, and that's in the ID field. If you want to use another field, like for example, if you want to use your file field, or some other unique ID like a locally assigned identifier, then you can change the name of the ID field in a configuration option. You just so you can say, I want to use my ID field is file, my ID field is field local ID, what have you. And the file field points to one piece of content, one file, either on disk or remotely. You can use HTTP addresses for remote files if you want as well. So if I use this configuration file to get some action here instead of listening to me talk, if we want to use this configuration file, put that back because my CSV file is called December 15th _ create CSV. Because I'm deviating from the default, which is metadata.csv, I need to tell Workbench in the configuration file, my input CSV in this case is not metadata.csv, it is December 15th _ create CSV. And that file is sitting in the input directory, which is a default as well. But again, if you want to have your files and your CSVs sitting somewhere else on your local laptop or your file share, what have you, you can point to that. So I'm going to do a new share here. This is my console in my laptop. I'm running Workbench. Workbench writes a log that tells you everything it's doing, pretty much everything it's doing, as far as creating content or deleting content goes, or the success or failure of a particular action around creating or deleting content or updating content. And it writes lines to this log that you can then inspect afterwards for troubleshooting or what have you. But I like to clear out the log before I run Workbench. And to run Workbench, it looks a little bit scary because it's command line, but it's actually only takes 2 arguments. You run the Workbench script like I've done there in the leftmost position. I tell it which configuration file I want to use. And it is super important to always add that option check, because when you don't, if you don't add that option and you just run, if I just ran it like this, it would just go ahead and create, it would interact with Drupal and interact with it in potentially harmful ways. It's going to upload content and create new taxonomy terms and all sorts of stuff like that. Even though it has pretty good error handling and preemptive checking, it can't really do anything too crazy to your Islandora. If it doesn't, things aren't right, but it will still create a lot of content that if you don't mean to, or something is not right, you are then faced with a cleanup job. You need to get rid of all that stuff that you just loaded into Islandora. So it's always better to add the check option before you run Workbench, because it does when you do that, it runs Islandora without uploading any content or modifying anything. It just gets the configuration from Drupal, all the field configuration and content type configuration and whatnot, and brings it down, and it checks to make sure that your CSV file and your files, if you're using files, adhere to all the requirements of the content that the field configurations have. So for example, your like a good example is geocoordinates, which are complex combinations of latitude and longitude. They have decimal points in them, and they need to be valid. You can't point to somewhere that's not on the globe and whatnot. So it will check that. It'll check those. If it finds a field that is configured to be a type geolocation field, we'll take all of the content in that column in your CSV, and it will run a validator on it and make sure that it is indeed, the values in that field are indeed valid lat-long coordinates. And if they're not valid lat-long coordinates, it will tell you, so you can fix them. So the workflow here typically would be run check on your content as many times as you need to until it passes, until it finds no more errors. That's going to save you a lot of grief, as opposed to, in contrast to uploading malformed CSV data, which again can cause a lot of problems. So I'm going to run check now just to show you what happens. And this is not going to create nodes or media. It's just going to check to make sure that my CSV file and my configuration file are all cool. So I'm running a, as you can see here from the output, a Vagrant on my local machine, so it's localhost 8000. And what Workbench has told me is that everything that it's checking for, it checks for a whole plethora of things, probably about 20 things. If they apply to this particular job, it has checked them and it is happy. It says at the bottom, configuration input data appear to be valid. If I look at my log, I mean, it prints this out to the console so you can see it, but it also writes it to a log, so that if you are in a situation where you don't see the output, like you're running this every night at 12:30 a.m. because you want to automate getting stuff into Islandora, your log will be there and it will tell you everything is cool, or if it finds errors, it will tell you, well, there's a problem, you need to fix this first. So I'm just going to do a new share and show you I have this is my Islandora. There's nothing in it. I'm going to go back. I'm going to run, this time it's going to create nodes. And of course, it's a little bit slower than just going and fetch when it did the check, because it's, instead of just going and fetching configuration, this time it's actually pushing content up to Islandora. when it finishes, it will just say done. Well, it doesn't say done, it just stops. Probably should have some message there saying 3 of 3 objects created or something. I'll open an issue for that. But if I go back to my Islandora, refresh the content listing, I see my 3 nodes. And if I click on one, I see the node. There is a description. The extent is a default value on that field. I didn't add it to the CSV because Drupal added it for me by default. That's the way the field is configured. So now that I've shown you one kind of standard, or like the kind of the most common case will be to create nodes. What I want to do is show you some of the features that I've added lately to do other kinds of things. So one of them is that you can, whenever Islandora Workbench creates nodes, it will write out a small configuration that will let you delete the nodes and all the media created for those nodes during that run. And it's called Rollback. And this, you wouldn't really use this in production. You would use this if you were testing or you're a developer and you just want to, you want to run this 20 or 30 times because you're testing a new feature or something, developing a new feature. So this is really a convenience, but I will demo it because it is super simple, it's automatic, and it's useful if you need it. And what I'm going to demo is that this is just the rollback configuration file and a CSV file that it creates are exactly the same format and requirements as the delete task in Workbench. So you see here it says task delete. This is just a delete task, but it's an automatically generated delete task based on what I just did in the create task. It's totally automatic. If you, just to show you what's in the rollback CSV, it just has a column node ID with the 4 node IDs. So it tells Workbench that those are the nodes you need to delete. And if I run that, I'm not even, like I just said a few minutes ago that you really should be running check every time. Yeah, I'll do it just because I want to be consistent and practice what I. So it does say everything's cool. The 3 nodes that are identified in that little CSV file, nodes IDs 4, 5, 6, I think it was, or something like that. Those are Drupal found. Workbench can ping them. It can see them. So they're there. And if I take away the check flag and just run it, it will go and delete the node and all the attached media. In this case, there's 4 attached media because it's generating fits and a thumbnail and stuff like that. But so there's your 3 nodes with all of their attached media. So that won't be, again, that won't be useful. The rollback feature won't be useful in production. Well, I hope it won't be useful in production. I hope you never have to do it. But it certainly is useful if you're testing or if things like that nature where you do want to just get rid of stuff you don't want to keep the stuff you just ingested. You want to get rid of it because it's just there for testing or temporary purposes. So moving on to something a bit more interesting, I hope, is, well, I'll be the judge of that, but delete this. And so sometimes you don't want to ingest media. You just want to ingest the node, that is the field data, the Drupal field data that you're creating your objects from. And you might want to do this for a couple of reasons. One is that media slows things down a lot. And if you don't need them for testing purposes, for example, you have a big CSV file and you just want to see if how the metadata looks in Islandora. You don't really care about the files or the media at this point. You're just testing your metadata configuration. And so if you want to do that, you can tell Workbench even though I have file column in my CSV and stuff like that, I don't want you to do anything with files, with media. I just want you to create the nodes. And to do that, all you need to do is say in your configuration file, nodes only is true. And if you do that, then Workbench will basically skip everything it normally does to create media. It just totally checks to see, is nodes only true? And if it is, just skip this whole bunch of stuff. And in doing that, lets you ingest the nodes only, that is to say the field data, very efficiently. I'm just going to go back and show you how this works quickly. There's my after I ran rollback, this is what is in my Islandora. If I go back to my command line, and I'm just going to clear that so you can see better. If I run Workbench, again, I really think it's important that you run check. It's checking my CSV. In this case, the CSV is just kind of the same as CSV that we used before, but if I'll let you take a look at it just for comparison's sake. So this is the CSV that it is using now, but it is, because it is configured to create nodes only, it is skipping the file references to the files. It does not create any media. Go back to our, oh, sorry, I didn't. Ran with check, and check doesn't. Check doesn't create nodes. See how much faster this is without creating media, which makes sense. If I now do a controller on this, it will show me the 5 nodes. I will show you that they don't have any media. It's strange. It's not. So there's the 5 nodes. Go back to Alcatraz Island, which we looked at a minute ago. No media, just the metadata. In this case, again, it's not super interesting. It's just a description and a title. But if we go into the edit form, you can see that the model is there as well. It's known to be an image. So I'm just going to delete. I could use a rollback again here if I wanted to, but I'm just going to delete these. Move on to the next demo, which is the opposite of what I just did. It is creating nodes from files only, no CSV metadata. And the reason you may want to do this is that you just want to get the files up there, and then later on have a metadata specialist come in and add the metadata, or just because it's part of your workflow. Or another option, another workflow you could use this in is to have a nightly watch folder. So your digitization group staff is just digitizing stuff, and they're not creating metadata. That's someone else's job. That's the metadata specialist job. But they just save the scanned images or whatever into a shared folder, and a Workbench is configured to run that evening after they've gone home. To run with this option, it pushes all the content, all the media up into Islandora, and automatically, because it's run on a scheduled job. And then those new media are ready to, those new nodes, I'm sorry, it creates nodes and media. Just there isn't a lot of metadata in the nodes. I'll demo that. So this is the configuration file for that. This is the task is create from files, localhost admin, Islandora, and so forth. I'm using a special input directory called this, and I have a model, which is again images. I'm also including an option here called output CSV. When I include this, Workbench will write out a CSV for me that contains all the fields that configured for the content type in this example, Islandora repository item, and with IDs for the nodes it created. And that then you can then give that to your metadata specialists, who will then have a ready-made CSV that they can populate with the other metadata. I'll show you that in a second. Give me a sec to set this up. So this is the, I need to get rid of this. I need to, if I wanted to. This is the input directory that I'm using for this next demo. This is just 3 files taken from Simon Fraser University digital collections of posters for the Vancouver Folk Festival annual event here. And what I'm going to do is, again, there's no CSV involved with this at all. It's just using these files to create nodes and accompanying media. And then the nodes are there in my Islandora. They're ready to be processed in some other way, either manually by going in one by one and adding metadata to each node, or using a CSV to then run an update task using Workbench to add the field data that is in the CSV. I'm not going to show you that part today, but I just want to show you how this works when I create nodes in this fashion. So I'm just going to go back to my Islandora for a second, show you that there's nothing in it. Go back to my command line. This is S15, I don't know, from files, create from files. And I'm going to run check here again. Because there isn't any CSV data, the check for this task is very minimal. It just says I can connect to Drupal. I found the input directory you've told me about, and that's it. If a file is in there, it's in that directory. We saw that file explorer a second ago that shows the 3 files. It's going to create a node for it. There we go. The title for the node, again, as I said a few minutes ago, title is not optional in Islandora. You need to, they're in Drupal. It's not an Islandora constraint, it's a Drupal constraint. You need to have a title. It uses the file name without the extension. So if you want to, whatever you can put in a file name, you can use as a default, as the title that it creates for you. In this case, you'll notice that the titles have spaces in them, and that's totally fine. You could use underscores if you wanted to, or dashes, or what have you. But if you want the title to not have to go back and edit the title, then you may as well use file names that have spaces. That could be a problem for your upstream workflows. That's probably the case in some cases, but the point is that whatever the file name is, that's what Workbench assigns as the title for this particular node. And if I go into the node, you can see that the image is there. Again, there's no extra metadata here because this is for creating from files only. It did create a, I'll show you that file. What did it call that file? So this is the CSV. It looks ugly when it's wrapped in my terminal here, but this is the CSV file that it spit out. And as the first ugly row is all the field names in the content type. So we have ID, node ID, which is the node ID assigned by Drupal. All that stuff is there. Not only the Islandora fields like local identifier, linked agent, and whatnot, but also the base fields: status, title, promote, sticky, blah blah blah. The 3 columns that you see at the bottom, which are more legible, are the each one corresponds to one of my new nodes. And as you can see, we have, there's no file column in this CSV because it assumes that you're creating, since you're creating nodes from files, you don't need that. But it has, so it has the ID, the node ID, which in this case is, you see it there, the titles. And then you can give this file to your metadata staff and they can go and pull it up into a spreadsheet or what have you and add the rest of the metadata if you want. So that's the second last thing I'm going to demo. The third thing I'm going to demo is probably a little bit more interesting to most people because it instead of dealing with nasty CSV files, you deal with Google Spreadsheet directly. I'm just going to clean up a little bit here. Also going to delete my media, and again, I really could have used the rollback feature. So we have no nodes, no media. Bear with me while I share again back to my editor. So in this case, here's my configuration file for not use. I'm not going to be using a local CSV file here. I'm going to be using a Google spreadsheet, and the Google spreadsheet is this one. Again, it's super simple, just for demonstration purposes, but it looks just like the CSV files that you would normally that I was showing you have been showing you so far for create tasks. So it has an ID. It has a file name, and the files in this case are sitting on my laptop. Like in other words, my metadata is in this Google spreadsheet, which is in the Google Cloud, but my files that I want to ingest with these nodes are sitting in a folder on my laptop, and the folder is defined. The location or the name of that folder is defined in the configuration file, which I'll flip back to in a second. But these files are in that folder. If I want to use remote URLs for files, I can do that, or I can use absolute paths like /temp/ blah blah blah. I have a title. I have a description over here, and this is like a typical description, textual description. And then I'm also going to demonstrate how I would add a coordinate field. And this is in the field coordinates in the Islandora object, the default Islandora object. And what I want to point out before I do this is, those of you who have used spreadsheets to create metadata for digitized collections or digital collections may know this already or may have seen this, but spreadsheets were not really meant for this purpose. They're meant for calculating numerical data. And so they have certain conventions, like if you enter a plus sign at the beginning of a field, even if that field, frustratingly so, in Google Sheets, if you enter a plus sign as the first character in the field, it thinks you're entering a formula. But we're not entering a formula, we're entering a standard, totally legit pair of geocoordinates. So in order to tell Google Sheets, don't do that, you need to escape the plus sign with a backslash. And you see that here, I've got a backslash in front of my plus sign. Islandora Workbench expects this, and it will just ignore and remove that backslash if it sees this at the beginning of a geocoordinate field. It kind of knows that if that's there, it's only there because it's required by the spreadsheet, and it's true for Excel as well. It's required by the spreadsheet, so get rid of it, ignore it. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to my text editor, show you their configuration file. So again, this is a standard configuration file, but instead of the input CSV value pointing to something called metadata CSV or something like that, it points to a spreadsheet. It points to this Google spreadsheet. This spreadsheet needs to be readable by the world. So you need to set the permission so that anyone with the URL, which we see here, can view the spreadsheet. Otherwise, Workbench can't get it, can't go fetch the CSV version of it. Something else I'm doing here, and this is not specific to the Google spreadsheet configuration, but this is a useful feature. It's called CSV field templates. So you may have noticed that my Google spreadsheet didn't have a field model column, and the model field in Islandora is required. You can't create objects without populating it. And in order to avoid having to put the same value in all, let's say I had 10,000 rows in my spreadsheet. You mean the spreadsheet? Yeah, sure, it's easy to do that. You just drag and copy it down. But in some cases, you don't want to deal with that because you want to clean up your spreadsheet, have it include as few columns as possible. But you want to apply the same field value to all of the objects in your spreadsheet. For example, a good example of this would be collection. If you want them all to be members of the same collection. So instead of having that one column in your CSV that contains the node ID of the parent or the collection, you can use a field template, which basically lets you take the field, and the field name is exactly the same as if it was appearing in your CSV, and give it a value. And you can use any number of these. You can use whatever number you want of these field templates, and Workbench will take that if they're present, take each one of those field values, and basically append them to the CSV file. So that when it runs to populate your Islandora, it will use a little bit of a different CSV. The CSV in this case has these fields appended to it, but they're there. And the important part is that when it pushes the node up to Drupal, that the field is populated the way it's defined here in the template. So let's go and run this to see how it works. That's my configuration file I showed you. I'm going to run check because it's a good idea. So you may notice that it says saving data from that spreadsheet to a local address or local location. And that's because the way that this works is it goes and fetches the CSV version of the spreadsheet and writes it out to a local copy, just for a variety of reasons, reliability and speed being one of the most important. But you should know that every time that you run Workbench, it goes and fetches a fresh copy of that CSV, that spreadsheet from Google Sheet. And that means that if you make a change in the spreadsheet, you correct a typo or what have you, because check has told you, oh, you have a malformed geocoordinate or malformed, whatever. You go fix it, then whenever you run Workbench again, it will go fetch a fresh copy and overwrite the one you have locally. So that's you're always using the most up-to-date version of the spreadsheet as possible, based on when you run Workbench, whether it's with the check option or not. So let's run this without check, and it will create the nodes. Just two in this case. Go to my Islandora and show you. Here's our two nodes. If I go into one, Britannia Beach is a famous mining, well, famous locally, and if you're an X-Files fan, famous because they shot multiple episodes there. It's an old mine between Vancouver and Whistler, and there was a fire up there in 1921. This is a postcard depicting the mill before the fire. Pretty standard stuff. It's not very simple. and there's a whole community behind the mine where the families of the miners lived. And so this is, I guess, a postcard depicting some of the fun times they had in the mines as opposed to the bad times. So that's all I'm going to demo for Workbench. But if you have any questions, I know that the ASU gang is ready to show their stuff. But if you have any questions, Melissa, do you want to do them afterwards, or how do you want to take questions?
There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'm not sure. I think you might have missed while you're doing the screen share. The first one is it picky about the encoding of the CSV?
Picky, well, it is because it kind of assumes UTF-8. And if you need something other than UTF-8, we could probably address that. But I mean, I've just gotten used to using UTF-8 everywhere and nothing seems to go wrong. So that's what it uses. But if you need a separate encoding, then I'd be happy to take a look at that and invite you to open an issue on the GitHub Workbench GitHub issue queue, and we can walk through it.
Okay, and next question is, when uploading a directory, can this pull any other embedded metadata? Does it identify it as a media type image?
Yes.
Apologies if I already covered that.
Yes, it does. So there were earlier versions of, so the media, let me see where this is illustrated. It has some sensible defaults. And if you want to override them, you can, but it is awkward to do so. So there's something down here called, this is the README. README is long. Right. So yeah, so these are the defaults, and these are kind of taken from Islandora's default configuration. If the extension of the file ends in one of those, it's an image, and so forth. You can define your own, and to do so, you do that in the configuration file, and you can do it in two ways. One is if everything in your batch is of the same media type, like if they're all documents, but they have diverse file extensions like that aren't in the aren't one of these, then you can just tell Workbench, don't check the file extension, just make them all documents. And to do that, you put this in your configuration file, media_type equals whatever it is. It has to be an existing and valid media type. You can't make them up at this point. It has to be real. And it will tell you if it can't recognize it. It will say, sorry, I don't know what that is. You do your check. If you want to be more specific about, if you want for some reason, and I honestly can't think of a reason you want to do this, but I built it anyway, because it used to be the default and I just made it simpler, left in the capability. If you want to define a media type to extension mapping, and you want to have multiple extensions, you can do it this way. You don't use media type in the configuration file. You use media types, and then you include a mapping like this. Anything that ends in MP4 or OGG is going to be considered a video. And you can list however many you want corresponding to your media types. So it's possible, but it's something you typically wouldn't want to do. But if you want to do it, there's a couple of ways to do it, and they're documented here in the README. And so that's all the questions?
Yep, other than thank you, you thought of everything after you answered the two questions.
Super. I haven't thought of everything, which is why I really want people to test it, because I have a very narrow band of CSVs and files that I test with. And some of the best fixes and features in Workbench have come when real users have provided real problems and they've shared their real CSVs with me. And that's what I would really ask of you is if you can share a CSV with me, I'd be happy to take it and run it through Workbench and see where it breaks and try to fix it and try to understand what you want it to do based on your content. So thanks, everyone.